The second reading this morning is from Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took him, Peter, and James, his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with them. When Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised with the dead." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Evelyn was driving the family home from dinner at a local restaurant. The kids were in the back seat. Her husband was in the passenger seat. It was a dreary day, dodging in and out of rain showers. Traffic was painfully slow. She was muttering to herself about the car that had just cut her off, when she looked up, and there it was in the rear view mirror. Spread across the sky was the most vivid rainbow she could ever remember. The arc went all the way across the highway and disappeared. Evelyn pulled off the road so abruptly that her husband asked if everything was okay. Evelyn said, "Look, look," pointing to the sky behind them. She got everyone out of the car, even the 2-year-old from the car seat, who squealed and started jumping up and down. The rest of the family leaned in close and stared in awe at the rainbow. Other cars stopped and asked if they were okay. Did they need help? They simply pointed to the rainbow glowing in the sky. And once they had about 5 cars stopped by the side of the road, a police officer stopped and asked if there had been an accident. They pointed to the rainbow. He was surprised that they had stopped for that and told them that they needed to move along. Of course, by that time, the rainbow was beginning to fade. The moment had passed. They returned to their cars and pulled carefully back into traffic and into the routine of their lives, but they did not forget the moment. Evelyn remembered the Bible story of how the rainbow symbolized the promise of God's goodness and felt reassurance on an otherwise dreary day. The vision on the mountain of Transfiguration seems to appear out of nowhere, much the same way the rainbow did on Evelyn's dreary drive home. The dreary story that sets up the Transfiguration actually occurs in the previous chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus announces to his disciples that they will have to go to Jerusalem, where he will suffer many things and die. More than dreary, that was demoralizing. Immediately, Peter pulled Jesus aside to straighten him out. In one translation, Peter tells Jesus, that's the last thing God would want. That's never, ever going to happen to you. To which Jesus responds, you're trying to trip me up. You're not looking at things like God does. Part of the problem for Peter is that things have been going so well in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is filled with these epiphany stories, stories that shine and reveal the glory of God. The Gospel opens with the angel announcing the birth of Jesus. Then there's a star in the heavens that points the way to where Jesus is. There are magi that travel across the desert to find Jesus. There's the powerful preaching of John the Baptist. There's the voice from heaven at the baptism of Jesus, and the Spirit descending like a dove. There's even Jesus delivering the Sermon on the Mount, like the second coming of Moses. So much of Matthew, the early part of Matthew, is a mountaintop experience. So when Jesus starts talking about his death, it's a catastrophic lapse. We're all familiar with lapses. We have a lapse of memory when we cannot recall a person's name or an answer on a test. We have a lapse of judgment when we trust someone who turns out to be unreliable. We have a lapse of concentration and we end up in an automobile accident. You can call it a loss of focus, a misstep, a misunderstanding. Here, Peter calls Jesus' talk about death the last thing God would want. It's the rug being pulled out from under the feet of the disciples. Instead of the mountaintop, it's like falling off the mountainside. Rather than Jesus revealing the coming presence of God, it is a sudden sense of God's absence. Peter does not understand that Jesus is taking them into the experience of absence. Lori Wood of Bentonville, Arkansas, remembers the day the doctor led her to the x-ray room saying, "If we're lucky, it's pneumonia." It wasn't. She spent months of testing only to find out that she was in advanced stages of heart failure. There was no warning. She was asked if she wanted to sign a do not resuscitate order. She says it was as if a crevice opened up beneath her. I lived in a foggy lapse of faith for nearly a year and a half. She wondered what was happening to her. Where was God? How could she ever get out of this hollow space? As she looks back today, she realizes that God was at work with her even within the lapse. God was drawing her closer every day. God was inviting her into a different relationship. God was giving her time to understand that even when God did not answer every request with a yes, God was present in the moment of pain. She learned to lean into that pain. She found support from friends who prayed for her, who brought her meals. After a time, Lori was hospitalized for pain the doctors said that she needed an emergency appendectomy, but according to her medical records, she might not survive. So they ordered an echocardiogram. And much to everyone's surprise, the test showed that somehow her heart function had returned to normal. Now she's in full health, but she's not the same person. Her faith is stronger than ever before. She describes it saying God worked in her in the lapse of absence. She now says she was lucky that it was not pneumonia. The mountain of transfiguration is one last reassurance before the disciples head down the hard road following Jesus as he led them to Jerusalem to suffer and die. What looked like a catastrophic walk into absence would actually be an invitation into the presence of God. It was God's way of working through Jesus to draw people closer day by day. It was, after all, the salvation of the world. Still, for a while, it looked like a terrible lapse of judgment. The vision of Moses and Elijah on the mountaintop was meant to reassure the disciples that God was at work in this. Just as God had appeared to Moses and Elijah on mountaintops, so God was present in the life of Jesus. Just as God was present in the cloud of Sinai as the covenant, in the covenant with Moses, God was now present to deliver God's people. Just as God came to Elijah on the mountaintop with instructions that he still had work to do, the disciples had work to do. They could not remain on the mountaintop. They would have to walk the hard road that might feel like a lapse. But really, they were being led to God. Life is mostly lived in those lapsed moments. Life is mostly lived between the mountaintops. Just as the disciples would have a long lapse of difficulty before they got to Easter, we live most of our days in the routine. Raisin is an Episcopal priest who lives in Iowa. She felt the presence of God in her early life. When others were listening to pop rock on the radio, she was listening to Beethoven. When others were learning to play guitars and drums, she played the viola. Her passion for sacred music grew, and her desire to know God made her the source of ridicule among her classmates. So she kept quiet about her experience of God as she drew the bow across the strings of her instrument. Then she lapsed. She stopped playing altogether. Education, family, job got in the way. She became a priest and married a priest, but her viola remained in the case. She forgot that it was part of her connection to God. Along the journey of ministry, someone found out that she used to play. They recruited her for a small collection of musicians who played at various events around their small Midwestern town. For Raisin, music was her sacred cloud. It was what took her to the mountaintop. It was what lifted her from the routine back into the presence of God. Some of the absences she felt in life were the result of her neglecting what connected her to God. Now when she plays, she is renewed in grace. Experience of God's grace came in a different sort of lapse for Andrew. His grandmother, Maki, had developed dementia. She cared for the family for years, but now the time had come for the family to take care of Maki. Maki wanted to stay in her third-floor apartment in New Orleans. Everything was familiar there. Any change would be disruptive. The family had a meeting and decided it was Andrew's turn to take care of Maki. Andrew had gone through his own lapse. Now he was sober and planning to continue his education in the fall, but it was still winter and his seasonal job had shut down. It really was his turn to take care of Maki. Yet it was in his caring that Andrew discovered great joy. Every morning he would say, "Good morning, Grandma Maki. Want some coffee?" She would reply, "I'd love some, but I can't make it anymore." He would produce the pot of coffee that he had already made, and he would hand her a cup. She would exclaim with delight. Every morning it was a joyful surprise. And then, after the first sip, she would say, I might just decide to go on living after all." Andrew remembers how that simple routine filled his life with grace. Just when he was struggling to believe that he could live a life of meaning and purpose, Maki marveled each morning at his ability to make coffee. According to Andrew, Maki's reaction to the morning coffee was as though it had saved her life. But really, Maki was saving his life. The vision of Transfiguration is not an invitation to live on the mountaintop. It is a reminder that in the routine of life, when we feel caught in the lapses of God's absence, God is still at work in our lives. By God's grace, we can be lifted up once more. In Jesus, God has drawn near to save us.